Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the Kid Lit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of Kid Lit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Kid Lit Love podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie, and I'm here today with Lizzy Rockwell. Lizzy is both an author and an illustrator of over 35 picture books. Yes, I said 35. She's here today to talk about her body of work and specifically her two newest books, It Is Time, The Life of a Caterpillar, and Am I a Frog? These are two delightful books exploring the science concepts of metamorphosis. Lizzy, welcome to the Kid Lit Love podcast. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, back on episode 3 of the podcast, I got to chat with James Preller, who is another prolific writer. Lots of books under his belt too, like Jigsaw Jones, Scary Tales, his newest Exit 13 series. And after we were recording, we were just having a conversation back and forth. He's this great human who has really good conversations. And we were talking about the podcast and who I might want to invite on so that I could learn more books and grow the audience. And he said, I know just the person. And here you are. So I'm so grateful for that connection and that you're here today. For those that don't know you yet, could you jump in and just tell everyone a little bit about yourself, your writing, and at least a couple of all of those books?
Sure. So I have been an illustrator since the mid 1980s. And I started out as a freelance illustrator for magazines and book jackets and all sorts of things. It never really occurred to me then that I would be a children's book illustrator. And part of the reason for that is that both my parents were children's book illustrators. And I sort of thought, that's their thing. This is my thing. I'm this young, hip New Yorker. I'm not that interested in children at the moment. But I think deep down, I really just thought it was a hard act to follow because to me, they are like legends in the field. And so I was a little intimidated to enter that world. And I was so interested in graphic design and fine art painting and just all sorts of things that went along with illustration that were not necessarily narrative, telling a story with a picture and characters doing things. I was more like really struggling and striving to find a style and a look and kind of, just be a new voice in the world of illustration in the magazine world, which at the time was very, very lively. There were tons, I sound ancient, but there were tons of magazines. They all had illustrations. Book jackets almost all had illustrations instead of pure type or photography on the covers. So it was a really nice dynamic time in the world of freelance illustration. But I did that for some years. And then my father, who was my mom's collaborator, Harlow Rockwell, was a collaborator with my mom, Anne Rockwell, a number of years her senior. And after a very great career as an art director in advertising, he started doing books with my mom that she wrote and he illustrated. And she also illustrated her own work. But they had a book contracted to do called Apples and Pumpkins. And it was the third in a series of books about the seasons. And unfortunately, my father died of emphysema after a long illness before he illustrated that final book. And in fact, he was in the middle of my Spring Robin about spring when he passed. And so I was a trained professional illustrator. So I stepped in and finished my Spring Robin in his style as best I could. And then the publisher agreed that I could illustrate Apples and Pumpkins. And so that was in 1989. And that was the first collaboration I had with my mom. And so now I'm still really a freelance illustrator, taking assignments and kind of following the lead of others. And I, during that time, I also started doing a lot of game illustrations, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was illustrating a lot of games. But Mom and I really got going on a collaboration, and we ended up doing a 15-year series of books about special days at school, such as 100 School Days, Career Day, President's Day, you name a holiday, we pretty much covered it. So that was really fun. And those books were very narrative about a cast of kids, in this classroom, multicultural group of kids and their teacher. And it really honed my ability and my interest in narrative illustration and telling a story through pictures, and not just having a concept or designing the page, but really thinking about how these two characters are looking at each other. And even if they're not speaking, what are they thinking? And this is just a whole new world of illustration that is so hard to do. And I wasn't born knowing how to do it. I really learned and taught myself how to do it. And I also did not go to school to learn how to do it. So I kind of learned it on the ground running, and very much being mentored by, my mom. I had been mentored by my father in the early days of my career. And then I had an editor that, I worked with as an illustrator, and we did some things that weren't by my mom, that were by other authors. And I said to her, I think I'd like to, her name's Nancy Cisco, and she's currently at Crown at Random House. And I said, I think I'd like to try writing. And she said, oh, I was just thinking that you should try. And we were doing science books. And she said, well, we're going to cover all these science topics eventually in this Let's Read and Find Out series. And would you like to try to write one of these? And one of them was food and nutrition. And I said, yeah, I love to cook. I love to eat. I'm not that concerned with nutrition, but I can learn. And so that ended up being the first book I wrote. And I worked on it for 5 years, I think, before it went to press. So it was a huge, steep learning curve. But it was a great experience. And I ended up working with Nancy, and then being handed off to Phoebe Yeh at HarperCollins, because Nancy changed jobs and went to another house, and that book stayed at HarperCollins. But then Nancy and I went on to do other books together. But yes, my first book was science, explaining things, trying to speak directly to the child from their point of view. And I was a mother of young children at the time, and that was not honestly that hard for me to do, at least point of view and voice. And I still think it's my strength that I always hear my voice with the child's ear rather than the adult ear, and kind of prefer the child's ear to the adult ear, and the child's eye to the adult eye in a lot of ways. So it's a place I'm happy to stay.
That's actually one of the things when I read the two books that we're talking specifically about today, that is one of the things that jumped out to me. When I think about the books that I loved as a kid, or the books that I remember as being influential to me in my reading life, the very first one that comes to mind is the monster at the end of this book, right? It's where Grover is talking directly to the reader. Don't turn the page, or oh my gosh, you turn the page. And as a child, you are just in it. You are in it with him.
Yeah.
This isn't just reading a book, it is jumping into the book and being an experience in the book. And as I was reading it, because the first one I read was Am I a Frog? I realized, ooh, we've got a conversation here that I can jump into. We've got, this back and forth. And even as an adult reader, who knows about these science concepts, right? And who might not have a little kid perspective, I was drawn into the books, I think, because I felt like you were just going right for the reader and not, not as a narrator, but just let me just involve the reader right from the get-go. And I love that. I love that about both of the books.
Thank you. Yeah, my texts often, if I looked at them, I might even say all, but no, I don't think all, but they often have question mark punctuation at various points in the text, because I am often talking to the reader, or the character in the book, as in Am I a Frog, is having a dialogue, but he's also asking the reader. And at first, I didn't have the second person in the dialogue. It starts out, who am I? Am I a frog? Not yet, but soon. You started in an egg. And so when my editor read it, she liked it, but she said, but who's he talking to? And I go, I don't know, the reader, God, like some omniscient, uh, you know, intelligent presence. And then Grace Macaron, my editor in that book, felt that it would be better to have somebody visible in the illustration, that the mouth doesn't move, there's no hand gesture, it's a snail. So we only can guess that the snail is answering, but when I ask kids who's having this conversation, they will identify the snail. But it was sort of tricky, because in the beginning I just felt it was an existential wondering that we all have, about who we are and what we're changing into. And, I have a grandson now, who's 2.5, and I think he wakes up every day, he's practically a new person.
Yeah.
What does that feel like? Like, as children are actively growing, I have a nephew who has stretch marks on his legs because he's getting so tall in adolescence. And so I just thought that the tadpole was such a beautiful metaphor for growth. And sometimes it's scary, and sometimes we're eager for it, and sometimes we just have no idea what's happening. But that my reader would identify with this animal, not as an other, but as, a relatable, sentient, animated creature. And I think ultimately that's what I want my nature books to do, is to make children relate to the natural world as being very much a part of it, and having empathy and caretaking for really all living things. So yeah, that was part of where that voice came from.
I loved that. And, I will admit, at first, as an adult reader, just reading through it, I was thinking, is this one of those books where it's, where two voices, where one person can read the one person could read the other. And then as I really looked at the illustrations, which is what kids always do, I thought, oh no, that's the snail, that's the frog. So I
Okay.
love that you've got this combined, you've got the power of the two voices in the text, but kids go to the pictures. They know that. And then I just had fun, like, oh, where is it on this page, and where is it on this page? And
Right. And I'm just reminding myself, yeah, the voices are in two different colors text,
yes,
which, kids, free reading kids may not notice at all, but the readers, the level G readers who are decoding it will certainly pay attention as their finger runs under the words, those different colors. And that was, again, an input by the editor and the art director, that, all that collaboration makes for such a better book, in my opinion. I love the collaboration of making books with other really thoughtful adults. And sometimes I get some kid input too, which is very helpful.
Yeah. We're all better together, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I would love to ask a question on the illustrator side, because
Yep.
you're speaking to someone today who can barely manage a stick person.
Yep.
And I used to say I'm not creative, and now I realize we're all creative in our own ways. But for me, words are where I gravitate towards. And I just so admire people who can bring to life what might be in my head onto the page like this. And so I'm just curious about your process of actually going about the illustrations. Do you start with hand sketching? Is it digital? Does it grow and change? Is it in your brain and you're just trying to represent it? I guess I'm curious about how that process is, in addition
Mhm.
to the process of how did you write the book and get the two voices and the different colors of those voices? How do you do this? It's just so amazing to me.
Yeah. Well, from my many years as a hired hand, illustrating other people's ideas, you're very used to, you know, looking at words, whether it's a whole magazine article or a children's book text or a title of a novel that you will read or not, read a synopsis if you don't have time to read the whole thing, or you read the whole thing. And so you're turning words into pictures in your head, and you're coming up with the the crucial moment, the crucial idea. And with illustration, it's not like animation or filmmaking. You have one moment to choose. And so from working with my mom on, I think we did 15 books or so together, and reading her texts, and fortunately for me, she was an illustrator. And so she always wrote knowing that there was a possible picture. Sometimes people with less experience writing picture books or with a less visual way of thinking will write beautiful prose, but it's, just people sitting on the beach having a conversation about feelings or something for page after page after page, and nothing dynamic has changed visually. But my mom would always write that you could really see this scene is changing into this scene. And so I would start with, when it's a text given to me, I would start with thumbnail sketches, which are little, 2 by, let's see, maybe 2 by 4 for a double page spread of a book, inches big. Always the gutters down the middle. This empty space will be where the type goes. I just do dash lines for where I'll leave some space for the type. And then, what is the big idea here? Is this a close-up of someone's, surprised expression? Or is this a big, wide landscape of the car driving, down the autumn farm landscape, and the little characters somewhere, tiny, tiny little face in that car? It's always sort of a cinematographer decision about where am I, and a director's decision about what moment, and the actor's decision about what expression and what body language. So you can capture that in a thumbnail sketch. You can capture the essence of that in that rough sketch, and you're much better off keeping it small so that you don't get distracted by details. So that's always my process. And when I write, I think unconsciously I have a picture in mind, and I always write, not always, but I try to write with the words already committed to a spread. to a page number, so that it's kind of like the book format is a built-in outline, and I work with my words within that structure. Um, and then I know that these words go with a different picture than these words go with, and we'll have a reason to turn the page. So it's really complicated, to be honest. You know, every picture book person goes through this, like this thinking in 3D time, psychology, you know, setting all at once. And of course, novelists do it too with no pictures. They have to be in a three-dimensional world and move through it, and have it, they build it and they walk through it simultaneously. I can't even imagine doing that, but what I have to do is hard enough. And yeah, it's not easy to explain. I don't know if I'm doing a good job or a very confusing job.
No, you did, because in my mind, you know, it's just all hard because I can't imagine myself being able to do something as artistic or creative as that and get it to look like this. But just hearing you talk about all of those decisions that are going on in the back of your mind, like the perspective or the characters, the actors, like likening it to a movie and then realizing you have to freeze frame on the perfect shot that represents that content, that I haven't thought about it that way. It makes it even more complicated in my mind, even more in awe of the people that are able to do that, because they just, I mean, yes, of course, the words are important, but the pictures, they bring so much. They bring the feeling, they bring the mood, they bring that immersiveness I talked about at the beginning. And I really didn't quite think of how much goes into the back end decision making. I was just thinking, even at this point, of that product on the page of what it looks like. And there's
Yeah,
a whole host of other things that go through your mind. Yeah, I'm just in awe right now of that explanation of I need to better appreciate those pictures on the page when I'm enjoying them as a
yeah,
reader.
yeah. Well,
Wow.
and it's I do talk about it a lot in school visits, you know, when I go and to schools and talk to children about where a book is made, because the main point of me being there is not even just to inspire their love of reading. Their teachers are really doing a great job of that, better than I could do, but to remind them that they have a voice and that they have a story in them, and that for them to become lifelong learners, they have to be so engaged, and they have to bring their own perspective into it. They can't just be obedient little, you know, rule followers all day long. They need to know that their voice, their creativity will be activated. And so I try to break down the creative process to a point that they can relate to it. You know, my rough sketches, my thumbnail sketches are so crude. I mean, anyone could kind of do them at that level, you know, but it's like, if you know this is going to be a big face, or this is going to be a landscape, or this is going to be, you know, a, a horse, like, you've already begun. And that's, if you can't begin, you can't go anywhere else. So reminding them that it just starts with this very faint little scribble, tiny little scribble on a page, and then, you know, and then you're building the house. You know, you draw the architectural drawing, then you build the frame, and then step by step you have this thing that's finished, and no one could imagine where it came from. But it's very, very helpful for kids to see you break it down and show that you make a folded little paper dummy that you staple together and you glue the words in place. And that's very much like the kind of books that they're doing in school too. So
Right. They instantly feel capable of that. And that's, you know, what you talked about is just a good life lesson too. Like, just got to
yeah,
start. Just got to
yeah,
do one thing and then see where it goes. Do you find that the kids, at least I know this in my experience, are so much more willing to try and think themselves capable of this kind of work than, than a lot of adults. But have you found that students really respond well to that and just dive right in?
Oh,
I love
yeah.
working with kids because they just take it all on.
They are, I mean, we can't say they and us because we are all former children, and that child still lives in us. And I think one of the privileges of this book job I have is to stay in awe of the child and my child, my inner child, and every child I meet. I mean, they're just really interesting, dynamic um, people who have really agile brains and very open hearts, and they are the best of human, you
Yeah.
know of humanness. They are the essence of being human, and they can't stay there forever, but it's not, our job isn't to teach them more how to become an adult, but our job is to help them remind us of what it is to be a human, and what it is to be kind, and what it is to be open-minded, and what it is to be emotionally honest. They are all those things. And people who work closely with children um, really are privileged to keep reminding themselves that, this is who we are at our essence. And yeah, so yes, adult students, and I work with a lot of adults, teaching art, and I teach quilting, and I do some staff development for preschool teachers. So I talk to adults a lot, and I always feel my job is to remind them to try to dig up that child in you, and be that optimistic, and that fearless, and that trusting, and that hopeful. um, Not that children don't get pretty anxious and frustrated and selfish, and they have a whole host of
Of
qualities.
course. Yeah, I love everything you just said, and I think that's part of what my hope even is for this podcast. In the opening of the podcast, I say I really think that everybody should read children's literature, from picture books to middle grade to YA, and yes, our adult reading lives, because we all still have an inner child in there, right? We
Yeah.
are still reading to our inner child. And there's just something, like you said, about being surrounded by kids or reading books with kids as characters that just lets you see things in a different way, a different
Yes.
perspective. And we all need that. We all need that sometimes.
Yeah.
That.
Yes. And it's important to be humble when we read children's literature, and to not say, well, this isn't a very good book because it doesn't appeal to adults as well as children. Like, there's a myth that a great children's book is just as great for the adult as the kid. And I think that there's an arrogance behind that if it's great for the kid, be curious about why. If you don't get it at first, be curious about why. Ask them why. What do you love about this particular character? Or we have a lot to learn from them. Yeah.
We sure do. We sure do. Although, I have teenagers right now, and sometimes sometimes it's a little bit harder to stay open to.
Oh, my husband's a high school social studies teacher. So, and yeah, we raised two teenagers, but same thing, stay humble. Stay humble. Just ask them why, what's behind that.
Yeah, and just listen. Just listen.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you're very good at it.
So that book we just talked about was Am I a Frog? But I also
Mhm.
want to make sure we give a little bit of time to the other book that you've recently published, which is It Is Time, The Life of a Caterpillar.
Mhm.
So this book doesn't have the same kind of two voice structure, but it is just as immersive, just as interesting. It is focused on similar science content. And as you mentioned, because I have the book here and I was going through it, You do ask questions of the reader, so it does still feel very,
Yeah.
very immersive. Is this the content that you love to write about? I know you've mentioned writing nonfiction. Is this science content, the natural world? And again, we're talking about caterpillars coming into their own, but so are kids, so are adults. So I can
Sure,
see those
sure.
connections that you mentioned earlier. So is this like your sweet spot that you love to write about?
Well, I have done quite a number of books with Holiday House about animals. Well, and in nature, we did Plants Feed Me about, edible plant foods, and then A Bird is a Bird, A Mammal is an Animal, um, and Am I a Frog? And It is Time, The Life of a Caterpillar. So that has been sort of a series, one book leading me into the next book. And I don't know if I mentioned I Love Insects, but I Love Insects was in the middle of that flow. And that was the first one that was a level G easy reader. And in that book, I had back matter about metamorphosis because one of the illustrations was a caterpillar. And so I figured, well, I have to explain what stage a caterpillar is because it doesn't have all the qualities of an insect. So I had back matter. And then my editor said, Grace Macaron again, she said, well, really, that's a whole nother book. And so I go, yeah, you're right. So I wrote Who Am I? And it was a book about a frog and a caterpillar, a tadpole and a caterpillar metamorphosizing. So it's a book about metamorphosis. And Grace, and it starts out, who am I? Am I a frog? And then we learn about the tadpole metamorphosis, and then it says, who am I? Am I a butterfly? No, not yet. So I did have the same structure for the caterpillar metamorphosis in that early iteration. But then Grace said, well, really, this is 2 books. I go, okay, well, let's do 2 books. So, but when I did Am I a Frog? So then I got, a commitment from the publisher to do 2 books. And Am I a Frog worked so well with this conversation and this very existential tadpole. And one of the reasons is because tadpoles have incredible faces. They are just so cute and funny looking, and they have these big eyes that can have a pupil and can look around, so there's a reason why there's so many frog characters in children's literature, from Frog and Toad to Jeremy Fisher. They're just really expressive animals. And when I went to do the next one, Am I a Butterfly? My really rough thumbnail sketches just were not translating into a character that was a caterpillar with the same kind of pathos that the tadpole had. And I did not want to make it a cartoon caterpillar. I really don't do that very often. So at least, and I especially didn't want to do it in an actual science book. So I decided that it would be omniscient narrator, 3rd person, but I decided that, and then the title changed to Caterpillar Changes, which is a nice title because changes could both be a noun or a verb. Caterpillar changes or caterpillar changes. But I wanted to keep the pronoun, I wanted to keep caterpillar as not an anonymous type of animal, but as this character's name. So caterpillar hatches, she eats, she crawls, she poops.
I
And
laughed just like a little kid would on that page.
yes, that line kills, it always does. But it was important to me to give the character a gendered pronoun because I didn't want to call the caterpillar it, because I wanted, again, to maintain that relatability, that it's a personification, of the caterpillar, because the caterpillar takes action and does all sorts of things. Even, takes self-defense action. It's not just a fungi on a log. It's a sentient creature. And I wanted to emphasize that for my child reader. And because the lowly caterpillar, is one of the most vulnerable animals in the food chain. I mean, they primarily exist to be food for other animals, but we need them. We need our butterflies, we need our pollinators, we need to be rooting for that caterpillar to survive its very fragile state as in its larval stage. So I wanted my reader to really be rooting for this caterpillar through bird predators and wind and rain and all the rest of it. So I made it. Grace wanted to change it to it, partly to avoid any gender conversation. I said, but the butterflies look different. The male and the female black swallowtail are different, identified gender-wise. So we can justify this is a female caterpillar. And in the end, she agreed. And it was such a subtle thing, but to me it really mattered that we call her Caterpillar, like that's her name, and we refer to her as she. So, and then it's very suspenseful to watch her, root for her to survive to this chrysalis phase, and then the slow immersion, eclosure is the science word, but immersion from the chrysalis, which of course in a level G East reader would call the pupa, right? Because chrysalis is that's a tough phonetic word. Even for me. And then just as in Am I a Frog, the great climax of the story is the frog leaping with all four limbs and this long tongue that the tadpole didn't have any of, to become a hunter, which is a huge change. And the big change for the caterpillar is to become a flyer, to have flight. So the big climax in the butterfly story is the soggy caterpillar dries out and takes flight, and that's the end.
Which I love that page because you have that beautiful butterfly, right? It's not a typical monarch butterfly, that might be just beautiful black
it's
butterfly.
A black swallowtail, yeah.
It's beautiful, but then you have the character whose arms are stretched out too, and it's just it was one of my favorite pages. I love that because of the parallel kind of movements there, where both just felt like they were flying. The other page I really loved was the page where it says a pupa is there, and it's the wonder, the look of wonder on the character's face looking at it, like, wow. It was so beautiful. Just that you captured that childlike wonder for this kind of content, and it was so lovely to see on the page. I loved it.
Well, I could relate to it very strongly because I did a lot of research for that book. And amphibian metamorphosis is super cool, but it is not as strange or mysterious as insect metamorphosis, where they literally, the animal dissolves.
Right.
Like I don't get into this in the facts of the book, but I mean, it dissolves into liquid and reforms itself as an entirely different animal. And the metamorphosis of an amphibian is a little bit more like mammal or bird, egg metamorphosis. It's just more of it is done outside of the egg. Right. But even humans kind of go through a metamorphosis in utero, and I did a book about in utero human development too, called Hello Baby. So I have a theme going.
That one. Wow.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's still in print. It's still in print and paperback. It came out in, I think, in 99. Yeah. but so I was watching my garden, and I raised, I planted a black swallowtail host garden with dill and parsley and rue and, all the good plants that they lay their eggs on. And then I had a flower garden with all the pollinating plants. And I raised a caterpillar. I didn't know I was doing this, but I had potted some of my parsley in a little houseplant pot that I brought into my studio, and I was drawing the plant, for a couple of weeks, just to practice. Even a parsley plant is complex, and you got to learn how to draw it. And I go into the bathroom and water it, and I bring it back. And I'm like, there is a 2-inch caterpillar on this plant. Yeah, and I hadn't seen it developing. They're very camouflaged, and it was like on the other side of the plant. And then I raised that caterpillar to a butterfly. And so it would do all the really cool secretive stuff when I was sleeping or out of the house, but
Right.
forming the chrysalis and coming out of the chrysalis. But it was cool enough to really spend time with it. And then YouTube has no shortage of people who do this very well and document every moment
Right.
of every stage. So I was just watching video after video. Oh, it was great. So that kid's awe, was my awe. Like, I had no trouble, conjuring that face. And the boy, he's on the end sheets, but he really doesn't even enter the story till a little ways in. And he's very much in the background. And the caterpillar, at least in this case, doesn't need him. The caterpillar, she does her whole thing as they usually do without any human intervention. But he's there as the privileged witness to nature's wonder. And again, there is a humility to that of we are not here to conquer nature, unfortunately, we are now in the position to save nature, but we never should have been. We should have just always been, collaborators and
Right.
holding our place in the web. But I want children to read my books about nature with that humility of, we are part of something very big and very important, and we need to respect it and love it. And it will give us so much back, if we keep our eyes open.
So this leads me to another question for you, because that's a pretty tall ask, right? That's a big goal and something wonderful that kids can read and think about. And this content, even just us talking about how fascinating it is, this content is big. There are some scientific concepts and scientific words, and you have managed to take that bigness, that complexity, and bring it down to an early reader book, which I
Yeah.
imagine looks like it's a lot easier than it was. And so I'm wondering about that aspect of your work, of how you took these really amazing science concepts, but then whittled it down to the number of pages, to words that kids could read at this particular level as well.
Yeah.
How did that work?
I would say I have had some great mentors, many of them being great children's book writers that I never met, like Leo Leone and Margaret Weiss Brown, and you know Lois Lenski, and just people who never minded talking to the amazing child that they were talking to. And I would put my mom in that category. She just, she's written biographies of Sojourner Truth. She's done Greek mythology. She's a very intellectual woman, with an interest in almost everything in the world. She did a biography of Filippo Brunelleschi. You know, she had her interests, but she could speak to a child so directly. You know, boats float; they float on quiet streams and wide oceans. Sorry, Mom, I'm not remembering the words exactly, but um, she she felt that writing really young picture books was more akin to writing poetry than prose. That the words, you're not dumbing it down, you're just finding the essence of something and you're giving it a beautiful sound, you know. So I learned a lot from her, and then I learned a lot working with Grace at Holiday House. And the first book that I wrote, Plants Feed Me, was sort of a follow up to my nutrition book. I wanted to do another wellness book that kind of took Michael Pollan's In Defense of Food opening line, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I'm like, the book was great, but really, that's the take home message, you know. And so I wanted to do that book for kids because the really young kids, preschoolers and kindergartners, were not probably going to understand Good Enough to Eat, A Kid's Guide to Food and Nutrition. It's a little sciencey, and nor do they need to start to have a good culture around food and wholesome food and whole foods. So that was turned down at Harper, and then I was encouraged to bring it to Grace, and she was, you know, extremely experienced editor in early nonfiction for children, and she was getting going on this Easy Reader series at Holiday House, and she said, you know, we think this should be, instead of 32, it should be a 24-page book, and it should be a leveled reader. And I go, okay, what does that look like? And so she sent it back to me. Pages were X'd out, and like raspberries was gone, you know, like some of my favorite words and concepts, and no clauses. And I was like, oh God, this is crazy. And I did cry a little bit to lose my, you know, my precious creation. But then I went back at it, and I changed it much more than she did. I unchanged a lot of her changes in favor of my own changes, but in the goal of writing these point A to point B sentences with no, you know, detours of clauses or commas or anything, it became so essentially true, you know, a very essential book about botany. And, you know, I eat fruits. Some fruits grow on trees. First the flower comes, then comes the fruit. Fruits have seeds. A seed can grow a new plant. Like, that is a gigantic concept that suddenly, with pictures, it's really all you need to know. It's the big truth about plants. And then, you know, we eat different parts of different plants. You know, we eat the flower, we eat the stem, we eat the fruit. Sometimes we eat the seeds, and then all the different seeds we eat. So and my original book did have a lot of these themes, but suddenly when I was forced to unwrite it a lot, it became even more essential, even more true, even more philosophical. And luckily I'm an illustrator, and I can draw pretty realistic plants, you know. And so I don't need to explain any more of what that flower to fruit process looks like in words. I will just show you, you know, what this beautiful apple blossom looks like in these different stages, and everyone's eating an apple. And you know, it was a great lesson. And so then I got more and more, you know, into this idea that we can be very, very philosophical about science, which science science holds the big mysteries and the big truths of the universe, and children are thinking like that from the day they're born. They are thinking much more existentially, much more cosmically than we end up, some of us do go on to be astrophysicists and heart surgeons, and we do get deep into those big mysteries, but children are already there. So, and if they are not visually impaired, they are visually very acute. Their whole first experience with anything rational, any kind of pattern making, any kind of emotional truth comes through their vision long before it comes through words. So as an illustrator, you can rely on that, for the sighted child. You can rely on that very almost superior intelligence that they have to your adult readers, many of whom are very visual still. But once we start reading, once we start decoding, once we start really activating that left side of the brain, we have to trade something off, in intuition and visual acuity. And so, but we don't have to. We can keep, trying to balance the two sides of our brain, well throughout our entire life. And I think that should be a goal for everybody, and that's that staying in that child mindset really helps us do. Not just to stay young or youthful, but just to have our brain be really the full set of capabilities that it's designed to be.
Yeah. And what a beautiful philosophy for you to bring to your books, to kids, to adults. Just having this conversation with you, I can see everything that you're saying about what you believe and how much awe you have just for kids and childhood and science and curiosity. Like, you bottled it. It's here in these pages.
Oh,
It's a beautiful message to send out there to all the kids, especially as as a former educator. I worked with kids. Usually the kids who had difficulty learning literacy, and it could be very difficult to find books that they wanted to read about, that were on content and topics that they wanted to read about, that had a readability level they could manage while still having those illustrations to feel like they're reading, air quotes, real books.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
I can really appreciate what you're saying. And I agree. Like, you've just boiled down these big topics to what matters most, to where it does feel lyrical, but also so accessible to so many kids, which is the ideal, right? Is to connect kids with books and to have
yeah.
them power inside of it and uncover it in themselves and in the world. And your books do that. They're
Thank
beautiful.
you.
They're
Thank you so much. And I really admire this. I like to read series that Holiday House has developed a big line of options, because they're phonetically accessible. Every book gets vetted by a licensed literacy specialist in this particular leveling system. And so they're phonetically accessible, but they are so, I think, they're so vastly interesting visually. They're using some of the best illustrators out there, and the artwork can be as sophisticated as you want it to be. Some of it is very funny. Paul Meisel has done a bunch. They're hilarious. So kids, those reluctant readers or struggling readers do not feel demeaned by them. They're not, they're not babyish. Like, their friends are going to want to read these books too, even if they're beyond the level G or beyond the level D, just because they're funny and they're interesting and they're, visually sophisticated. So yeah, I really am proud to be a part of that lineup.
Yeah. Are there any other things you're working on that you can give us a sneak peek to?
Well, I have a book in the works that just found a very happy home, that's going to be published, although not till 26, which is a little ways away.
But
But
we'll be here before we know it, I'm sure.
yes, absolutely. And it's called Everybody Get Ready, A Kid's Guide to Personal Hygiene. So it's going to be, those my busybody book was about the systems in your body that are amazing, that make you work, muscle, skeletal, neurological, cardiovascular, and how you care for those through being physically active. But this one is about the parts of your body that you can see. So your hair, your skin, your teeth, your nails, and how and why you want to take care of them, and how those external parts of you protect you from germs, and what you can do to help that immune system be its best. So I'm really excited to dive into this book.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a whole lot of things, just in drawers and corners and in the back of my head. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's never ending what you might want to talk about with a kid.
Right.
And what my 2.5-year-old grandson, just his perspective is so interesting to me. So I'm sure he'll inspire other things. Yeah.
Well, and in the meantime, you have quite the backlist listeners could go take a look at while
Yeah,
they wait for the newest
you.
one to come out in 2026. Where can listeners find you? Is the best place your website, social media?
Yeah.
Where could you
Um,
direct?
my website is Lizzy Rockwell with a Y, LIZZYROCKWELL, .com. And I have a secondary website, which goes with a book we didn't talk about at all today, but it's called The Altogether Quilt. And it's a book for a slightly older audience, and it's about community quilting. And it's about a group that I actually meet with every week. And we make quilts that go to libraries and other places, an intergenerational group. So I created a website to go with that book, and it's called thealtogetherquilt.com, just one word. And yeah, those are the best places. I'm also on Instagram. If you just type in my name, my handle, which is my name sort of backwards, will come up. And then I'm on Facebook, and yeah, I'm not really active in social media, but I'm there.
There, we could find you there. And I'll make sure to
Yeah.
put links to both of your websites and your social media handles in the show
Okay,
notes so that people could easily find you.
great. Stephanie. And I'll say, you may not think you're creative, but you are an educator, and that takes tremendous creativity. And without knowing it, you're creating structures for storytelling. And just this interview and your very thoughtful questions, I'm alone with these thoughts all day long, every day. I don't articulate them too frequently. So you are the instigator to this conversation, and I'm really really grateful to be a part of it. And you made me feel very at ease, and that's a gift also.
Well,
So
thank you for that.
yeah.
I will think twice before saying out loud I am not creative, and I will remember your words. They mean a lot. Thank you. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. And everyone, thank you so much for listening. And I'll see you inside our next episode. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Kid Lit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of kid lit love. Thanks for listening.